The greatest of all time. How Muhammad Ali made black kids believe they could be somebody. There was something about the way Muhammad Ali moved that made you believe in magic. The way he danced around the ring, feet impossibly quick for a man his size, hands flashing out like lightning then pulling back before you could even see them move. The way he talked, predicting the round he'd win in, calling himself the greatest, when the whole world was telling him to be humble and quiet and grateful, the way he stood up to America and said no when they tried to draft him for a war he didn't believe in, willing to lose everything, his title, his money, his freedom, rather than compromise his principles. If you were a young black person in the 1960s and 70s, Muhammad Ali wasn't just a boxer. He was proof that a black man could be brilliant and beautiful and uncompromisingly himself, that you didn't have to shrink or apologize or bow down to make it in this world. He showed you that greatness was something you could claim for yourself, that your blackness was something to be proud of, and that standing up for what you believed in mattered more than any championship belt. Do you remember the first time you saw Muhammad Ali fight? Maybe it was gathered around a small television with your family and neighbors, everyone crowded into one living room, because not everybody could afford to watch the fight on their own. Maybe it was listening on the radio, your father and uncles hanging on every word the announcer said, erupting in cheers when Ali landed a combination or dancing out of reach of his opponent's punches. Maybe it was the next day at school, hearing about it from kids who had watched, everyone trying to imitate Ali's shuffle, throwing phantom punches and declaring themselves the greatest in high-pitched imitations of his voice. Wherever you were, however you experienced it, Ali's fights were events that stopped everything else, moments when the whole black community held its breath and hoped and prayed and celebrated together. Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Clay in Louisville, Kentucky in 1942, growing up in a segregated South where being black meant knowing your place and staying in it. But from the beginning, he refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on him. He started boxing at 12 years old after someone stole his bicycle, and a police officer suggested he learn to fight before confronting the thief. That moment of theft and anger and redirection led to one of the most significant careers in sports history, a career that would transcend boxing and become about so much more than what happened in the ring. He won a gold medal at the 1960 Olympics in Rome, fighting for a country that wouldn't let him eat in certain restaurants or stay in certain hotels because of the color of his skin. The story goes that he wore that gold medal everywhere for days, proud of what he'd accomplished, believing that Olympic glory might shield him from American racism. Then he tried to eat at a whites-only restaurant in Louisville and was refused service despite his medal. The humiliation and anger from that experience stayed with him, shaping his understanding that no amount of achievement would make white America see him as fully human under the existing system. When he turned professional, Cassius Clay was everything boxing had never seen before. He talked constantly, predicting victories, composing poems about his opponents, calling himself pretty and fast and destined for greatness. The old guard of boxing, both black and white, told him to be quiet, to let his fists do the talking, to show respect for the sport and his opponents. But Clay understood something they didn't. He was creating a persona, building anticipation, making himself into a spectacle that people would pay to see whether they loved him or hated him. He was controlling his own narrative in ways that black athletes had rarely been allowed to do. In 1964, he fought Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship. Liston was the favorite, a terrifying figure who had destroyed previous opponents with brutal efficiency. But the young Cassius Clay, just 22 years old, danced and jabbed and frustrated Liston for 6 rounds until Liston quit on his stool, unable to continue. Clay had done what he said he would do, shocking the world and claiming the heavyweight championship. In the ring after the victory, he shouted at the reporters who had doubted him, "I shook up the world. I'm the king of the world. I'm pretty. I'm a bad man." For young black people watching, that moment was transformative. Here was a black man refusing to be humble in victory, claiming his greatness loudly and proudly, telling the world exactly who he was and demanding that they recognize it. He wasn't being respectable or non-threatening or carefully neutral. He was being bold and confident and unapologetically black at a time when black people were supposed to be grateful for whatever crumbs white society threw their way. Days after winning the title, he announced that he had joined the Nation of Islam and was changing his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. The name Clay, he said, was a slave name given to his ancestors by white masters. Muhammad Ali was his true name, his Muslim name, a name he had chosen for himself. The announcement shocked and angered white America and made many white sports writers and fans turn against him. They refused to call him by his chosen name, insisting on calling him Cassius Clay as an act of disrespect and denial. But Ali stood firm. "I am America," he said. "I am the part you won't recognize, but get used to me. Black, confident, cocky. My name, not yours. My religion, not yours. My goals, my own. Get used to me." For young black people, especially those involved in or influenced by the Black Power movement, Ali's transformation was inspiring. He was rejecting white definitions of who he should be and claiming the right to define himself. He was connecting his personal identity to a broader political and spiritual movement. He was showing that success didn't have to mean assimilation, that you could be great and still be authentically yourself, connected to your community and your values. Then came the moment that would define Ali's legacy beyond boxing. In 1966, as the Vietnam War escalated and the draft intensified, Muhammad Ali was called to serve in the U.S. military. He refused. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he said. "No Viet Cong ever called me niggy." He explained that his religious beliefs as a Muslim minister prohibited him from participating in war. He argued that it was hypocritical for America to ask black men to fight for freedom abroad when they didn't have full freedom at home. The response was swift and severe. Boxing commissions across the country stripped him of his title and his license to fight. He was convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he remained free on appeal. He was vilified in the media, called a traitor and a coward. For 3.5 years in the prime of his athletic career, Muhammad Ali was banned from boxing, unable to earn a living in the sport he dominated, facing the possibility of prison, all because he refused to compromise his principles. But in black communities across America, Ali became a hero. He was standing up to the government, refusing to fight in an unjust war, willing to sacrifice everything for his beliefs. Young black men facing the draft saw Ali's courage and found strength in it. Anti-war activists of all races held him up as an example of principled resistance. He spoke at colleges and rallies, articulating opposition to the war and connecting it to the broader struggle for racial justice. He became a symbol of conscience and resistance, showing that there were some things more important than money or fame or even freedom. Do you remember those years when Ali couldn't fight? How the elders in your community talked about him, with respect and admiration for standing on principle, even when it cost him everything. How young black men debated whether they would have the same courage, whether they could give up their career and risk prison rather than fight in a war they didn't believe in. Ali's stand against the draft raised profound questions about patriotism, about duty, about what black people owed to a country that had oppressed them for centuries. In 1970, the Supreme Court would eventually overturn his conviction, and Ali was allowed to return to boxing. But he had lost 3.5 years, from age 25 to almost 29, prime years when a boxer's speed and reflexes are at their peak. Everyone wondered if he could still be great, if the layoff had stolen his greatness, if the best of Muhammad Ali was gone forever. He answered those questions in the ring, fighting his way back to championship contention, proving that his skills and determination were still intact. The fights of the 1970s became legendary. The fight of the century against Joe Frazier in 1971, where Ali lost for the first time in his professional career in a brutal, exhausting battle that showed his courage and Frazier's relentless power. The rematch in 1974, where Ali won a unanimous decision, avenging that loss. And then, later that year, the Rumble in the Jungle in Kinshasa, Zaire, where Ali faced George Foreman, the younger, stronger, harder-punching champion who was supposed to destroy the aging Ali. That fight in Zaire became one of the most significant sporting events in black history. The entire nation of Zaire embraced Ali, chanting, Ali, Bomaye, Ali, kill him, as he trained and prepared. For Africans and African Americans, the fight represented something beyond sports. It was happening in Africa, with a black promoter and black fighters, and a black audience, without white control or white mediation. It was a celebration of black excellence and black achievement on African soil. Ali understood the symbolism and embraced it, connecting himself to Africa and African liberation struggles. In the ring, Ali used a strategy nobody expected. Instead of dancing and moving as he always had, he leaned against the ropes and let Foreman punch himself out, absorbing tremendous punishment while waiting for his opportunity. The technique, later called rope-a-dope, frustrated Foreman and exhausted him. In the 8th round, Ali came off the ropes and knocked Foreman out, reclaiming the heavyweight championship at age 32, 8 years after it had been stripped from him. The victory was more than athletic achievement. It was vindication, redemption, proof that Ali's stand against the draft hadn't destroyed him, that his greatness was enduring and real. Young black people watching that fight, whether in person in Zaire or on television across America, felt a surge of pride and possibility. If Ali could come back from everything he'd faced, stripped of his title, banned from his sport, threatened with prison, vilified by the media, and still reclaim his championship, then anything was possible. His resilience became a model for how to face adversity, how to maintain dignity and determination when the whole world seemed against you. The Thrilla in Manila in 1975, the third and final fight against Joe Frazier, was perhaps the most brutal and demanding fight of Ali's career. Both men pushed each other to absolute limits in the Philippine heat, throwing punches with exhausted desperation, refusing to quit. Frazier's corner stopped the fight after the 14th round, unable to watch their fighter take more punishment. Ali would later say it was the closest he ever came to dying in the ring. The fight showed Ali's warrior spirit, his refusal to surrender, his willingness to endure anything to prove his greatness. But Ali's impact extended far beyond his fights and his championships. He changed how black athletes understood their role and their power. Before Ali, most black athletes kept their political opinions to themselves, understanding that speaking out could cost them their careers. They were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to play sports, to entertain white audiences without challenging the social order. Ali shattered that expectation. He spoke his mind on politics, religion, race, war, and anything else he chose to address. He showed that athletes could be more than performers, that they had platforms and voices that could be used for purposes beyond sports. He influenced a generation of black athletes who followed him: Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jim Brown, Bill Russell, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, athletes who understood that their success gave them responsibility to speak out on behalf of their communities. The tradition of athlete activism that exists today, from Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem to LeBron James speaking on social justice, traces back to Muhammad Ali's example of using athletic prominence as a platform for political expression. Ali's relationship with the media was revolutionary too. He understood how to use television and interviews to craft his image and spread his message. He was funny and charismatic, giving reporters memorable quotes and sound bites. He was strategic, knowing when to provoke and when to charm. He controlled the narrative around his fights and his life in ways that athletes before him had never imagined possible. He turned press conferences into performances, making news even when he wasn't fighting. His poetry and predictions became part of his legend. "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee" became one of the most famous phrases in sports history, perfectly capturing his boxing style. His pre-fight poems predicting the round he would win created anticipation and drama. When he actually knocked out opponents in the predicted rounds, it seemed almost supernatural, like he was controlling reality through the power of his words and will. For young black kids growing up in the 1960s and 70s, Ali was a hero who showed them multiple ways to be great. You could be physically excellent like Ali the boxer, fast and skilled and dominant in the ring. You could be verbally brilliant like Ali the talker, witty and articulate and commanding attention whenever you spoke. You could be morally courageous like Ali the activist, willing to sacrifice personal gain for principle and justice. You could be all of these things at once, refusing to be confined to a single role or identity. Ali also showed black children that intelligence and athleticism weren't opposites. He was often underestimated intellectually, dismissed as just a loudmouth fighter, but his understanding of media, his strategic thinking in the ring, his ability to articulate complex political and religious ideas all demonstrated a sharp and creative mind. He challenged stereotypes about black athletes being physically gifted but mentally limited, proving that the same person could be both a brilliant athlete and a thoughtful, articulate human being. His conversion to Islam and his pride in that faith showed black youth that there were alternatives to Christianity, that African Americans could choose their own spiritual paths, that religion could be connected to racial pride and political resistance. The Nation of Islam's message of black self-determination and separation resonated with many young people frustrated by the slow pace of integration and the continued prevalence of racism. Whether or not they agreed with all of the nation's teachings, they respected Ali's commitment to his faith and his willingness to sacrifice for it. The way Ali talked about being pretty and beautiful challenged norms around black masculinity. He wasn't afraid to call himself beautiful, to admire his own face and body, to take pride in his appearance. In a society that told black people they were ugly, that black features were undesirable, Ali's celebration of his own beauty was radical. He had African features, full lips, broad nose, dark skin, and he called himself pretty as a girl. He refused to accept white beauty standards or to seek validation from white approval. As Ali aged and his career wound down in the late 1970s, he fought longer than he probably should have, taking punches that damaged his brain and contributed to the Parkinson's disease that would affect him for the rest of his life. Watching him in those later fights was painful for people who loved him, seeing his reflexes slow, his feet less quick, his face taking punishment he once would have avoided. But he kept fighting, perhaps because boxing was who he was, perhaps because he needed the money, perhaps because he couldn't imagine life without the ring. His retirement in 1981 marked the end of an era. For people who had grown up with Ali as a constant presence, his retirement felt like losing something essential. But his legacy was secure. He had changed boxing, changed sports, changed how black people saw themselves and how the world saw black people. He had shown that principle mattered more than profit, that dignity was more valuable than approval, that speaking truth was worth the consequences. In the decades after his retirement, Ali became a beloved global figure, respected even by many who had hated him during his fighting career. The country that had once vilified him for refusing the draft came to see him as a hero of conscience. The media that had mocked and dismissed him came to recognize his brilliance. He lit the Olympic torch at the 1996 Atlanta Games, his hand shaking from Parkinson's, but his presence still commanding, still powerful, still moving people to tears with the simple dignity of his being. But for black people who had lived through his prime, who had watched him fight and listened to him speak and seen him stand up to America at the height of his powers, Ali never needed rehabilitation or redemption. He had always been the greatest, not just as a boxer, but as a symbol of black pride, black resistance, black excellence. He had shown them what was possible when you refused to accept limitations, when you claimed your own greatness, when you stood on principle no matter the cost. Young black boys shadowboxed like Ali, threw jabs and hooks and combinations while shuffling their feet and declaring themselves pretty. Young black girls heard him talk about black beauty and felt a little prouder of their own features. Young black students heard him speak about Vietnam and racism and injustice and found language for their own anger and frustration. Young black people of all kinds saw Ali be unapologetically himself and learned that they too could refuse to shrink or apologize or accommodate. The lessons Ali taught went beyond sports. He taught that you could define yourself rather than accepting others' definitions. He taught that principle was more important than popularity. He taught that speaking truth was a responsibility, not just a right. He taught that greatness required sacrifice and discipline and relentless dedication. He taught that being feared and being respected were not the same thing, and that respect was what mattered. He taught that you could lose everything and still be great, that external circumstances couldn't touch the core of who you were. When Muhammad Ali died in 2016 at the age of 74, The outpouring of grief and celebration was global, but for Black people of a certain generation, the ones who had grown up with him, the loss was profoundly personal. They had lost a hero, a symbol, a reminder of what they had been and what they had overcome. They had lost the greatest. Do you remember watching Muhammad Ali fight? How did his courage in standing against the draft inspire you or people you knew? What did it mean to you to see a Black man claim greatness so loudly and proudly? What lessons from Ali's life have stayed with you?